Hey everybody, welcome back. Recently, MIPtalk had the chance to partner up with the Kellogg Innovation Network at the Northwestern Business School in Chicago, Illinois.
At their recent summit, I had the opportunity to speak with Kimmie Weeks. Kimmie is an acclaimed civil rights activist from Liberia. He's also the founder of Youth Action International. Now that's a really important organization that has helped out over 150,000 people in Africa. Let's check out the interview.
Well, KIN is just a summit that I enjoy. I got to know about it last year for the first time and was invited to speak. And of course I had been to many conferences and summits before, but there was something very different about KIN, and it's different because of the people, the perspectives, but I think more so because people are genuinely interested. People genuinely want to connect. They genuinely want to help and find ways to help. There's a lot of big conferences, especially when you have high-level people coming in, that's very sterile, and people are really not engaged. They're sort of like really not connecting on a deep level. And I think that's one of the great things with KIN. And when I spoke last year after the speech, what was incredible for me and my organization was that the next day at lunch, within 10 minutes, KIN had raised $50,000 to support our work in Africa.
That's incredible.
It was absolutely incredible. I mean, people just poured out and said, this is something we believe in, let's get behind it. And the opportunity to be back this year has given me the chance to then update KIN about what has happened since then and the progress we've made.
So in that context, I'd love to specifically talk about the work you do. And I know you come from a country that sort of has a unique relationship on the African continent with the United States because it, in fact, was formed by former slaves from a darker period in American history.
Yes. Well, Liberia is unique in terms of the relationship with the U.S. In fact, it's called America's only unofficial colony. It was freed slaves from the U.S. who had been freed and decided that they wanted to go back to Africa. And it was 1822 that the first group of slaves arrived in Liberia. And in 1847, they established it as a country. And basically, that was the birth of Liberia. Interestingly, the slaves started to repeat what they had seen in the U.S. So they started to open plantations. They started to rule the native Liberians with an iron hand. So from 1847 to 1980, there was a one-party state only by the freed slaves, or called Americo-Liberians. And then what happened in 1980, there was a shift. Samuel Doe, who later became known as one of Africa's biggest dictators or worst dictators, took over. And the country started to fall apart. It was also the end of the Cold War, so a lot of money that used to come into Liberia started to drain out. And Liberia just started to go on that plunge, essentially. By 1989, a man named Charles Taylor, who's now at The Hague for war crimes and crimes against humanity, decided that he wanted to launch a revolution to change Liberia. And he essentially came in with a rebel army. And that led to Liberia being embroiled in what is now one of Africa's most brutal civil wars, which went from 1989, had a brief ending point in 1997, restarted again in 2000, and only ended in 2004. Oh, wow. So that's sort of like the big history of the U.S. And Liberia. But Liberians, for the most part, still consider ourselves to be America's stepchild. Even though in reality, Liberia really doesn't get a lot from the relationship in terms of aid, in terms of support during the war, etc. And I think for all Liberians, the war, especially for me and my mother, was a critical turning point. I was 9 when the war started in Liberia, so obviously we had never thought we would ever be in a place where we would see war. We never thought there would be a situation where we would be hungry without food, etc. But when the war came to our home, my mother and I were moved from our homes, and we, along with thousands of other Liberians, were put in a refugee camp. And I remember us being in a very, very small room, a classroom, with 16 other families. I mean, we were just laying on the floor. I mean, people were everywhere crammed together. And we were in this place at this point. The national electric supply had been turned off. Water had been turned off. I mean, grocery stores, doctors, nurses. I mean, everything you can think about that made life normal had gone away. And while we were there was a point. I mean, I'm obviously 9. We had no food. I mean, people are suffering and dying. No medication. People are getting sick. It reached a point where there was just so many people dying that they just stopped burying people. And they would just pile the bodies up. So you would
there's
look
a stench of death everywhere.
Everywhere. And you would just see every evening as the bodies were just being piled up in the distance. And I started to become sick as well. And there was a point where I was just drifting in and out of consciousness. But for a while, each time I would wake up and I would look up, I would see, my mom would be there, and there would be this reassuring smile on her face.
So she was always there as
she was always there, exactly, sitting down, reassuring. Most evenings were just drinking hot shoe, just warm water, just so it felt you had something in your stomach, or roots and leaves to eat. But there was a point where I hadn't gotten up for longer than usual. And people in the room started to get concerned that I had died and my mom was hiding it. And so they kept asking her, and she kept saying, "Oh no, Kimmie's fine." And then at some point, they just stopped believing her. 2 of the men in the room held her, and another person who wasn't even a medical doctor felt my pulse, and this person said, he's dead. And so right there, they wrapped me in the cloth that we were laying on.
That's
and
incredible.
took my body out to one of the heaps and discarded me. Yeah, essentially. And it took my mom, who after they let her go, I mean, she didn't know because there were so many piles. I mean, she was going from pile to pile for hours until she eventually found me. And all I remember is just feeling this, violent shaking on my body. And I woke up and I look up and I see my mom's face, and I can see the tears and grief in her eyes, which I had not seen her cry through the war. So I knew something was wrong. But I had no idea I was laying on a pile of dead bodies. And that was incredible. A month into being in the camp, and we stayed there for 6 months. And during the course of the Liberian War, over 200,000 people died, most of them from hunger and disease, and that's 10% of the population at that point.
So there was about 2 million people.
About 2 million people at that point. So it was just a horrific circumstance. But what came out of that for me was this dedication. I mean, when my mother told me what had happened, I said essentially that I would spend the rest of my life ensuring that no child went through what I went through.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That work has obviously expanded into other places across the African continent that are facing difficulties of poverty, famine, war, disease, and the like. So obviously that awareness and that dedication to mission that emerged out of the experience that you had has led to really a lifelong body of work.
Well, it's definitely been a journey. I mean, we're now an international organization, but in Liberia there were all small organizations that I started initially and then grew from there. When I came to the U.S. In 1998, I was forced out of Liberia because, again, Charles Taylor was training former child soldiers, and a large part of my work was disarming the children. I mean, the youngest person who fought in the Liberian Civil War was 6 years old.
Amazing.
So just imagine a 6-year-old child running around with a machine gun, essentially. So a big part of my work was disarming the children. And at some point, Charles Taylor was training children at a national military base, and I was 17, spoke against it, and suddenly had the entire national army and military and police trying to find me. I mean, they shut down my high school. They arrested a lot of my classmates. All the editorial staff of the newspapers that had carried my report were arrested.
Was your life in danger?
It was absolutely in danger, and for 3 weeks I was in hiding. I mean, I was going from a friend's house to friend's house. And every night I would leave one house, or a couple of nights the soldiers would show up there looking for me.
Amazing.
Until eventually a friendly government said, "Hey, we'll help you get out." And I left Liberia dressed as a traditional dancer. The deploy was that we were going on tour, and I crossed over the border with a passport under the name Gregory Coleman, and then eventually came to the U.S. But then once I got to the U.S., there was suddenly this, I looked around and said, there's incredible resources here.
And you're in your late teens at the time.
Yes, I was, by the time I got here, I was 18. And, I said, incredible resources here. What we can do is something that's not just for Liberia, but can work across the African continent. So by 2005, I had started Youth Action International. The whole idea of the organization is to work in post-war countries. Those are the countries where, because the war is raging, the international media has turned their eye.
Sure.
International support has drained away. But if you think about it, that's the critical time that those countries need all the help they can get.
And the recovery after war.
The recovery, exactly. That's the critical point. Otherwise, then they fall back into war again.
Sure.
So we said, let's prioritize post-war countries. Let's focus on education, healthcare, economic empowerment, because I believe those are the three key things. If you can educate the population, you make sure they're healthy so people can work and they're not dying, and you provide the training and the capital so they can start their businesses and be self-sufficient, essentially. And if you can do that on a massive scale, you're able to change entire countries.
So let's talk about some of the countries, in fact, that are a focus now, and perhaps some of the challenges and opportunities of each. Are they uniformly all the same, or do some have different considerations, if you will, than others?
Well, they're inherently different, but they all have the similar story that they've been through through war and extreme chaos. We've worked in Rwanda, we've worked in Uganda, Liberia and Sierra Leone. And Liberia and Sierra Leone are right next door to each other. Very similar stories with the wars. I mean, the Sierra Leone war is very, very brutal, essentially. But those are the countries we focused on, and those are the places that we're heavily engaged in right now. And on a relatively small budget last year, we're able to reach out to 150,000 young people in those countries, providing skills training, providing agriculture skills training, providing education in terms of teacher training, massive teacher training programs, providing early childhood development programs. So it's a wide range of programs. And the big part is micro-lending as well to the young people. So they get out there, start their businesses, and we're truly seeing the change in the lives of young people who are going to the programs and are coming out, and they're able to feed themselves. They're able to feed their families. And now what we're doing right now is saying, how do we do that on an even larger scale with entrepreneurship conferences and workshops and innovation workshops happening across the rural areas, and reaching in one of those workshops hundreds of people just gather from all the nearby villages to come and learn and get ideas of best practices from other places that they would never have heard of before, but then they start to spark ideas.
Is Youth Action International itself a micro-lender, a microfinancer, or are you partnered with other organizations that are providing those financial resources to entrepreneurs?
We've actually done it in-house in the countries we've worked in, and it's a different model, because a lot of the money does not come back to the organization. It goes back into the co-ops we develop, so they continue to grow, and essentially that means that the more capital they're able to gain, they're able to build their businesses and grow their businesses. The whole idea is not to have people just remaining with very small businesses, but to continue to grow their capital that it can scale up.
So it's interesting you had mentioned the co-op model, and is it the same as other examples that perhaps we're seeing with Grameen and some of the others, where really everyone in the co-op is ultimately responsible, so there's that idea that you want to pay back not only because it's the right thing to do, but because there are other people who, if you don't pay back, are ultimately going to be responsible for it. It seems like that sense of accountability is really what it creates the level of success.
Right. And I mean, the way it starts off is it starts off as a group business. So there might be a group of 5 women who have a tailor shop, and so that's their co-op, essentially, those 5 women. But then what it gives them the option is, at some point, if one of the women wants to start another business in addition to that, she's able to borrow from the central pool of funds and then repay it with interest. So then their capital essentially continues to grow. But there's that assurance with those women that they're in it together.
Sure.
And there's that unity.
It's interesting you mentioned women. Are women predominantly the folks who are the business owners and the entrepreneurs that you're finding in terms of the countries that you're working in?
Yes. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, we run 2 what we call Center for Women's Empowerment, and those are exclusively for women. So every year between those 2 centers, 600 women come through, and they get training on vocational skills, counseling, how microlending works, etc., how to use the banking system, because most women wouldn't even feel comfortable going into a bank. We bring in lawyers to do their legal rights so they understand what their rights are, etc. And so 600 women go through that program every single year, and those are the women who are starting the businesses, being engaged, and we're seeing a lot of success with it.
We've talked about the fact that the majority of your work focuses on post-war countries and post-war economies, and the idea of really inspiring an individual a sense that they're not defined by their circumstances, but that there are skills that can be learned and opportunities that can be created with regard to entrepreneurship and the like. Kin Global's focus this year is a discussion on global prosperity. It's a word that in different contexts in the developing and developed world can mean different things.
Well, I think, especially on the level of where I've come from, I wouldn't measure prosperity by the number of people on the top layer who have access to it. I think for us, especially in a country, prosperity within the country means that the bottom of the pyramid all have access to the basis. Now, it's not the sense of we've got to make everybody from the bottom of the pyramid wealthy, but prosperity of the country being measured by the fact that everybody within the bottom have access to the basics. They're able to send their kids to school, they're able to provide health care if necessary, they're able to feed their families.
So it's obviously not just economic wealth and economic resources, there are a variety of other factors.
Well, exactly. The general happiness, and I think there's something called
happiness index.
The happiness index.
From Bhutan, I
yes,
believe.
Yes. So that's essentially, I believe, how that we should be measuring prosperity, essentially, because if universally all of the world's people have access to these basic resources, we'll have less wars, we'll have less acts of terrorism, would have much less hatred in the world, because a lot of the hatred and a lot of the anger is because people in a lot of the developing world have access to so little or nothing. And people are able to see in other places where people are wasting stuff. Now, it's not being envious of other people's success. It's just that people in some of the poorest countries are working their hardest. So they're not lazy, they're working their hardest.
Sure.
But because of circumstances, cannot even break that $1 a day ceiling, essentially.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
In terms of the work you do as an NGO, there's an interesting discussion going on in the States right now over the course of the last 2 years with the presidency of Barack Obama and a belief that there's a course of people who are making the argument that we're heading towards socialism and over-reliance on government and sort of an interesting ideological tit-a-tat that's emerging.
I think government is a huge one, especially in African countries. A part of the problem with Africa is a vacuum of leadership, good leaders, leaders with integrity, honesty.
It seems like always when you hear about the leaders there, perhaps with the exception of Nelson Mandela, that you're always hearing about the bad rather than the good.
You're always hearing about the bad. I mean, there are some good ones. I mean, the current Liberian president, Ellen Sirleaf, has been doing her best to fight corruption, etc. But in African countries, if governments are able to focus more on their people, and if they're able to focus more on the well-being of the country, not their individual wealth or enrichment, Africa would actually have no need for international aid. There's actually no reason that Africa should be depending on aid from outside.
In fact, isn't aid actually really hurting the local population more than it helps?
Help, especially the kind of aid that's food aid, that's aid dumping. That's not sort of like
aid dumping. That's an
exactly
term.
Aid dumping. That's not helping people move out of poverty, but it's almost like making it entrenched. Because I gave you the example of even Liberia. We're doing a rural assessment. And young people themselves were telling us, listen, before you do anything on innovation, you really have to change our mindset. I mean, there has to be a whole series of workshops, et cetera, training of changing our mindsets, because we've gotten so used to just receiving handouts. We've become, that whole idea of a dependency culture has happened in Liberia. that as soon as people see an NGO coming in, the sense of, well, we're entitled to something, they're going to give us something, we don't have to work for it. And that has to change, and people are realizing that. They know it has to change, but they need that push. So government has to guide that. The private sector has a huge role to play. When I speak to business schools and I speak to colleges, high school students in general, the one thing I say to them is you don't have to work for the UN or do humanitarian work like me to make a difference. You could actually have a bigger impact than me by running a business in a developing country that employs people and is sustainable. And you're going to make your money,
you bet,
but you're helping people as well. So
jobs.
Businesses, jobs, job creation. I mean, Liberia has an 80% unemployment rate right now. We will fall back into war unless businesses can be created. And so private sector, huge role to play.
Are you starting to see that shift, that there are multinational companies or even entrepreneurs from outside of Liberia who are seeing the opportunities and considering that they might want to go and start businesses there?
Well, people are, and there's a lot of people coming from outside. My thing is it actually also has to be led by Liberians, even on the business, because you don't want to have the situation where all of a sudden everybody from the outside realize there's great opportunities in Liberia and they flood Liberia, and suddenly the local people have no access.
Sure. It's a version of aid dumping in a way.
It
it's
is,
the same
exactly,
challenge.
because that just marginalizes the people. Now, this is another role of government. Government could be facilitating the capital for Liberians and the training for Liberians so they can be able to compete with people from outside. So it has to be a two-way street. We need investors from outside, but we also need to forge individuals from within inside the country to become a part of that.
Does Africa have, or does it need a technological infrastructure so that they can be a part of things like the internet and other things like that? Where are the realities of education now, and where do they need to be so that Africa can that the African continent can compete on the global stage?
Right. I mean, again, it varies from country to country, but
course.
from a Liberian, Sierra Leone perspective, we're light years apart from the U.S. There is no way we could even, at this point, even say we're trying to get to where the U.S. is.
The work has not really begun.
It has not even begun. I mean, I go to schools in the capital. First of all, you might have a classroom built for 30 students that has 150 in there. We've seen schools, I showed a slide here at Kimmie yesterday, that had students simply sitting on the floor, no notebooks, no pencils. I mean, even the teacher didn't have a notebook or a pencil or a blackboard to write on. I mean, you guys are doing electronic boards. I saw one of the electronic boards in a classroom, blew me away. I mean, teachers don't even have blackboards. Right. So light years apart. Youth Action International did a teacher training in Liberia. It was one of the first and the largest in post-war Liberia. We did it for, originally we were told we would get 200 teachers. We opened it up, 900 teachers came in. We only had capacity for 650, standing room only.
Amazing.
But then we did a survey of how many of the teachers knew how to use a computer. Out of 650 people, there was actually only about 5 people who had actually touched a computer
in their life.
Teachers in their lives, 5. So that tells you that we're very far behind. Now, there's an eagerness to move in that direction. But for now, we're still just working on the basics, teacher training, getting classrooms built, providing materials, etc. So the problems that you guys face here in the U.S. and we face are obviously very different, and a lot must be done. But if you think about it, unless we can create an educated population, we're not going to move forward. Sure. That's going to be what's key for Africa education.
So I do understand your point that obviously each country within the African continent is different from the next. But can you point to examples that you have seen, perhaps either in the countries you have worked or in others that you have not, that are a model for the type of direction that you would hope to see your work and the work of your colleagues ultimately moving towards?
Well, I mean, ideally, I was just in Tanzania for the World Economic Forum. and we got the chance to go out and see a lady who had started a micro-lending enterprise in Tanzania. Now, what she was doing was not loaning money; she was leasing equipment to women. So, if you think about it, there might have been a woman who had a small, business where she was doing a milling, a maize, for example.
So the equipment to support that.
Exactly, providing that equipment, leasing it to the women, and then they're able to repay it over time. And I think that was a model, and I believe now she has 35,000 people in the program.
Wow.
And it works because you're giving people the equipment they need. You're not giving them the resources, so there's less risk of people going and spending the money elsewhere, etc. But you're giving them the technology they need, the resource, the equipment they need, and they're able to put it to work right away. And they're able to grow their business exponentially and be able to repay their loans. So that was one great example I saw, and we were able to see some of the women that they were working with, and they're exporting stuff now, and they've grown their business largely. But I mean, across, and I was saying to when I spoke yesterday, that Africans are vibrant people, and that's across the board in all the countries. Very vibrant, very resilient. Okay, there's very, very few places that people, the whole idea of $1 a day. There's very, very few places that people would survive on $1 a day. I mean, you probably wouldn't be able to survive on $1 a day.
Would not be able to survive on
But these people are making it work. And that says to us that if you provided even the little opportunity to push them forward instead of like the big push that needs to happen.
Sure.
What do you think they'll be able to do?
Increments, steps.
Exactly. But the potential, it's incredible. It's just a vibrant, incredible, lots of ingenuity I see as I travel through some of the countries. I mean, I was in Sierra Leone, and I met this guy. He had never been to school, never had any formal training. But from scratch, this guy had developed a rice cooker. Okay, you could call the rice cooker from a cell phone, and it would start cooking. And when the rice was done, it would send a text message back saying rice is cooked. I mean, so ingenuity is across the continent, but people don't realize that.
That's incredible. We've talked about the fact that you go to a lot of conferences. You're here at KIN, and certainly our audience is going to be exposed to you and the work that you do. If you could point to one or a handful of things that you would define as needs at this point. There are a lot of incredible people in this country who really do want to help, and sometimes perhaps have the misconception that food aid is the way to do it. What are the things that you need that can really assist you in the mission and the work that you're doing?
Well, there's two things. I mean, we're, again, a small organization. Our budget last year was $450,000. This year, $600,000. So we've grown it.
So money is a part of it.
Money is a part of it. So that's one, just getting in the resources. There was a point that people were starting to get comfortable giving internationally. With the crisis in America now, a lot of people started to pull back. And I think it's very, very unfortunate because it was reaching the point where people were giving wisely. They were giving to Africa, and changes were starting to happen. And we really need people to say, listen, I will do something here, but I will also do something over there, that we're all connected. We're all one people. We're all next door neighbors. Now, there's no such thing as way over there. We need the resources. We also need the know-how. We need people, and I've invited some of the professors from Kellogg and some of the business students to join us in Liberia and Sierra Leone to help look at the economy, help identify markets that people, might be open to Liberians, etc.
Wow.
So we just need the human resource. We need people to give their expertise. There's many people who've retired in the U.S. who are great minds in their fields, but they're not doing anything right now. Well, we need
really
you.
Contribute
Come, you can contribute.
No,
Come,
that's outstanding.
we'd love to have you.
In terms of people finding out about you online, is there a website or places that we might direct our audience and others to?
Yep, our website is www.youthactioninternational.org.
Okay.
Or putting my name into Google, Kimmie Weeks, will bring it up. And we're everywhere. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, MySpace, High Five. So we encourage people to check it out, and there's lots of information and updates on the website.
Excellent. Well, we will make sure to link and share with everyone. And Kimmie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
really amazing interview with Kimmie, and it was so great learning about the important things that he's doing with the Youth Action International.
For more interviews from the Kellogg Innovation Network event, log on to MIPtalk.com.